Hello, we're going to look today at a passage in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 that says some very peculiar things. It seems to describe a time when Jesus is going to be in the clouds, and then somehow dead people are going to be raised, and they're going to float with him in the clouds. And then other people who are believers, who are living at the time when Jesus is floating in the clouds, will then join him in floating in the clouds. At least on the surface, that seems to be what Paul is saying to us, which if we think about it, the idea of kind of floating in the clouds, that sounds to me like a terrifying prospect. I like looking down at clouds or being in clouds when I'm in an airplane. Not so fond of the idea if I'm not in an airplane. But really what Paul is doing in this passage is not using literal language. He has a mix of metaphors here. In fact, he's got at least three metaphors going on in this passage to try to convey his idea of what a return of Jesus would look like by using Old Testament language and by also using cultural language from his own time. But Paul was essentially dealing with a concern that the Thessalonians had concerning those who had died. They understood that Jesus was going to return. They understood that Jesus was going to restore all things in his world. So they wondered about those who had already died, whether they would still get to participate in this renewal, or whether their luck had run out, so to speak, by their dying. And so Paul needed to answer, he needed to respond to these concerns, which he apparently had not addressed when he was with the Thessalonians. In fact, he said, I don't want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death. This is apparently not an issue that Paul had covered beforehand. He did cover that Jesus is going to return. He did not recover what is going to happen to those who die in the interim. But the very basis for everything that Paul believes here is in verse 14. He said, for we believe that Jesus died and rose again. And so we believe. So the foundation is that Jesus died and rose again. And so when we come to this passage, we must understand that our own story is to be analogous to what happened with Jesus. And what we believe is that the very body of Jesus was resurrected from the dead. When we say resurrection, we're not saying that Jesus became a disembodied person who could then kind of float around. His very body was resurrected from the dead. Therefore, Paul argues, our idea of resurrection cannot merely be that some soul of ours or some essence of our existence will then be disembodied and be with God somewhere. That is not and cannot be what resurrection means. It has to mean the restoration of the bodies of those who have died. Their bodies must be resurrected. So the resurrection is very physical. It's not about becoming disembodied. It is a very physical kind of experience. But here's what Paul said in this passage. He said, and this is all so that we don't grieve like the rest of mankind when we're faced with death. He said this, according to the Lord's word, we tell you that we who are still alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. Fallen asleep is a way that Paul likes to talk about those who are dead, because he's communicating that their death is not permanent, that they will indeed wake up someday, or that they will be resurrected someday. So the text says, for the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Okay. So we have Paul working with several analogies here. And to help us understand that it is an analogy, other than the fact that it's going to be very obvious when we compare it to the Old Testament, we have elsewhere Paul saying that Jesus is simply going to appear. Not that he's going to come back in the clouds, not that we're going to see a Jesus kind of floating on the clouds up there somewhere, but that Jesus is suddenly just going to appear. He's just going to be here. So we have, for one, the idea of him coming down from heaven with a loud command and with the voice of the archangel and with the trumpet call of God. Reminds us, for one, of Moses. Remember when Moses was involved in the establishment of the covenant between God and Israel? He went up the mountain. In fact, he went up to be in the clouds. He was surrounded by clouds and by lots of thundering. And then when Moses came back from the clouds, he was meted partway by the elders as Moses was going back to the people to deliver the covenant. And this was all concurrent with lots of noise, with trumpeting, and so on. And so Moses returned to the people from being in the mountain. Jesus is like Moses. He's gone up the mountain, so to speak, and he's in the clouds, so to speak, and he is going to return from being in the clouds. Another example of this imagery in the Old Testament is regularly in the Psalms. We hear of God coming in the clouds. God might come in the clouds for judgment, or he might come into the clouds to rescue his people. But God regularly travels in the clouds in the Psalms. But the Psalms are poetry. It's not that the psalmists necessarily believe that God was literally riding around in the clouds like the clouds were a chariot, although he did put it that way. It's metaphorical imagery to suggest that God is in control of all creation and that God was going to intervene. So when we have this image of Jesus riding on the clouds, we find Paul describing Jesus as if Jesus was God because, well, Paul did believe Jesus was God. And we find Jesus on the clouds because he's intervening in history. So, there's this loud command, there's this voice of the archangel, there's this trumpet call of God, which is probably three ways of saying the same thing. And then we have the dead in Christ will rise first. You don't have to worry about those who have already died before us. They will be resurrected from the dead. They did not miss the resurrection. They did not miss the transformation. Their bodies will be reassembled. They will be resurrected from the dead when Jesus comes in the clouds, as is described here. Then Paul said, after that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. Now, why on earth would Paul say that we're going to be up in the clouds, up in the air? Well, he's also working from a very prominent passage in Daniel. Daniel described sometimes an individual or sometimes as a group. The idea that the group or the individual would unjustly suffer at the hands of evil leaders, of evil people, but that God would vindicate the person who suffered, and that they would come in the clouds. That is, from heaven's perspective, they would go up into the clouds, and they would then sit on the throne. This is some of what Luke's thinking is when he tells us about the ascension, that Jesus went up in the clouds. The point isn't that Jesus was or wasn't in the clouds. The point was that God was declaring to all the world that Jesus was right all along, that Jesus suffered unjustly, that God was declaring his righteous verdict of Jesus, that Jesus had done the right thing all along. Well, if this is what God did for Jesus, this is also what God will do for his followers. Why are we described as going up into the clouds? Well, the Christians who have suffered unjustly down through the ages will finally be vindicated. It would be God's way of saying, hey, they did do what was right. And I'm declaring to all the world they did what is right. So the fundamental point isn't whether or not we will be in the clouds. The point is that God will vindicate his people, that God will declare to all the world, hey, they have suffered unjustly. They belong to me. So as much as anything else, it's a means of rendering judgment of who God's people really are. And so they're caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. So this is never about anything like disappearing or of people being left. It's only about the people of God being vindicated. Now let me give you a final picture as to why Paul would have described the second coming of Jesus in this way. In fact, our parable from today about the 10 virgins could do a great deal to help us understand this. In the ancient Roman world, whether it be in the Roman culture at large or for that matter in Jewish culture, when somebody important was on their way to you, you went out to greet them. For example, when Jesus came on the Palm Sunday, that first Palm Sunday, the people left Jerusalem to welcome him into Jerusalem as the king. If a major Roman city knew that Caesar was coming to town, they would prepare and they would welcome him well outside the city so that they could bring him into the city. Same thing in our parable today. When the bridegroom arrived, the virgins did what was normal in their culture, a normal way to honor the groom. They leave where they're at, they go to where the groom is, and they welcome the groom back. Paul never seemed to like to miss an opportunity to declare to the believers that the world's true Lord was Jesus, not Caesar. And here's another opportunity for him to do that. Jesus' entry is going to be far more exciting than any entry that Caesar ever had. Jesus is going to come from the clouds. At least Paul's describing it that way here. He comes from the clouds, and his people go to welcome him in, to welcome him to our world. That's what's going on here. He comes in the clouds, not so that he could leave again. He comes in the clouds, but the idea is that he comes all the way down, starting in the clouds. We meet him in the clouds, and we welcome him into our world as the world's true Lord and King. In a way that's similar to the way the ancient world would have welcomed Caesar, the way they welcomed Jesus to Jerusalem, the way they welcomed the bridegroom. Jesus will be welcomed as this world's true Lord. Now, how literal this will actually play out, not so sure. Like Paul said elsewhere, he'll just describe Jesus as suddenly appearing. He never, in any other place, describes Jesus as coming on the clouds. He never describes the second coming quite this way in other passages. And in light of all the analogies and in light of all the metaphors that come from various Old Testament passages, I have to think that Paul's probably speaking predominantly in metaphor here. But the reality, of course, behind the metaphor is that Jesus is coming, that those who have already died do have hope. They will be raised from the dead. And those who are followers of Jesus who have not yet died, when Jesus comes, they will be transformed. Their bodies will be transformed. And as Paul said, we will be with the Lord forever. We gather from Paul's other texts that God will restore the world at that point, that he will render judgment on the world, which again, we have the idea of God's people being vindicated at that point, being rendered righteous at the final judgment. And so we have the idea of Jesus restoring his world and us being with him forever. And so Paul said, encourage one another with these words. This is our hope in the midst of death, especially in death that has become even more prevalent in the midst of this pandemic. It's a word of hope as we face death. It's even a word of hope as we face life. We don't know what the future holds, but we do know that Jesus is in control and that Jesus is going to return. And so we have that hope that we hold on to today and tomorrow. God bless you, and go with God.